So we're going to talk about cryptoeconomics for the Nervos common knowledge base. If it's not obvious, right, Jen has mentioned a few times about CKB. That stands for common knowledge base, which is our layer 1 protocol. Thank you. Okay. So we want to think about, what an ideal cryptoeconomic design would be. So let's think about from the first principles, right? And specifically for smart contract platform, the ideal cryptoeconomics design should be sustainably secure, sustainably decentralized, should be aligning interest of all the actors of the system, right? It should be providing an engine of growth for value generation and also value capture, right? So in other words, the cryptoeconomics should help the project grow and accrue value to the blockchain. And also there should be a mechanism that the value should be accrued to the holder of the tokens, right? So that's what we say is the ideal design. And let's look at where we are today. Okay, so let's kind of breaking down all these aspects. So let's look at security first. Now, a lot of the security or economic design for the security is really up to the security of the consensus protocol. And a lot of the new projects coming up today, nowadays you find, are using new and unproven consensus design. Now, I'm not saying these are bad, right? But these still will take time to figure out. And like any software anybody writes, they will have bugs and people will find exploits, different ways of attack vectors and so on. So again, I'm not saying these are not worthy experiments, but on the consensus layer or consensus level, a lot of the projects have newer consensus design. And the next 2 points is kind of leading to a very touchy point in the crypto community, which is hard caps. Now, having hard caps could lead to problems. One of the obvious ones with hard caps is Bitcoin. And I'm quoting this paper from CKWN CCS16. You can just put this into Google to learn more about this point they're making. But I'm just quoting 2 lines from the abstract of the paper. High variance of block reward makes it attractive to fork wealthy blocks, right? Right. So this make it attractive so that in other words, when block reward stops, right? When the hard cap is reached, then miners will only be rewarded by transaction fees, and then the miners will have different set of incentives other than what's desired in the Nakamoto consensus to follow along its chain, because the first point. And also selfish mining can be profitable for a miner with a arbitrarily low hash power share, right? Share as in percentage of the overall hash power rate. Again, I'm not going to dive into this. If you're interested, please read the paper. That's here on the page. Okay, so that's having hard cap. The problem of having hard caps is you're going to reach it, right? And you're going to stop one day. And when you stop, then this is a realistic problem that nobody has now, at least since then, given satisfying answers yet. Now, not having hard caps could also be a perceived problem. What do I mean by that? And this is the idea of if the cryptocurrency just infinitely, issuance is indefinite, that means the token I'm holding will be indefinitely diluted over time, right? So even there's value accrued to the blockchain itself, ecosystem, but my share of the overall market share, if you will be increasingly diluted over time, right? So I may not be better off, even the entire blockchain ecosystem is winning, okay? So let's look at the next. So I'm just talking about some of the problems, right? So this is also kind of a security-related problem. We call this heavy asset problem. And so the idea is for multi-asset smart contract platforms that you don't only just have the platform token as the asset, but also user-defined tokens like ERC20s, or we call asset tokens, right? So the problem here is, as your assets become more valuable, there isn't a sure way that you can transfer the value to the native token, right? So the idea is, okay, let's say Ethereum, right? So let's say the aggregate asset value on Ethereum goes up 100-fold, 100 times more valuable. What that means is for an attacker, it becomes more profitable to double spend these assets on Ethereum, right? Everything else being equal. Now, to make this equally secure, the ETH token, the platform token, have to grow, the value of the platform token have to grow with the asset value on top of it, right? Otherwise, you have this increasingly more profitable bounty, but the same defense, right? So that's leading up to problems. So we call this heavy asset problem, right? If it's too heavy, you may break the back, right? Or the platform. Okay. Decentralization. The cost of running full nodes, right? So like any computer systems, computation, bandwidth cost, and storage cost. Now, computation and bandwidth cost are mostly bound in the current blockchain systems. Bitcoin binds have bandwidth bound, and Ethereum throttles on computation throughput, right? But state storage is not, right? So none of the current mainstream block systems have restrict state storage, which means it will be increasingly growing indefinitely, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit. We'll spend a lot of time on this later, but I'm just pointing out the problem here. Now, full nodes are essential for independent verification, resilience of the network, and to hold miners accountable, right? So if anybody coming more from the Bitcoin world, then it shouldn't be a surprise to say that full nodes are very, very important, right? All right. So, okay, we're coming back to the state storage point, right? So let's look at the growth for Ethereum state. I actually didn't find exactly the size of the state, so we'll just use this approximation. The y-axis is actually in number of entries total in smart contracts, which is very good approximation of total global state, or the state tree, right? You can see from the inception of Ethereum, it grows very, very slowly, and then all of a sudden, this is like hockey stick, right? It goes up very, very rapidly. And remember, this is only for, Ethereum has been around for 4 years, 3-4 years, right? Depending on where you count. There's only for very limited adoption, and maybe, Ethereum today, maybe there are 10,000, 100,000 accounts. Maybe the real people using Ethereum over the years, the active ones, probably in the magnitude of 10,000 people, right? So if we're talking about a blockchain in the future that can really, sort of public infrastructure that the whole world can use, then we're saying we're looking at growth of at least 1,000 to 10,000 times in terms of people participating into the blockchain, and which means that the state tree will probably grow to that many of times. Okay. All right, so this is related, right? We call this the tragedy of storage commons. You hear us talk about the tragedy of commons very often in the context of cryptoeconomics design, right? Because that's one of the central theme of problems that current systems have. All right, okay. So the problem here for Ethereum, for example, is pay once, store forever, right? So when you submit a transaction and you are growing the state tree and you store some data into the global state, then you pay for the cost of the transaction, but then you can have all these states stored forever without cost, right? So to give you some examples, right? So there are quite a few very large state smart contracts that have very large states. For example, EOS ICO contract, right? So a lot of people participate in that, and probably tens of thousands or 100,000 maybe. So that data right now is on Ethereum ledger forever, which means everybody will save a copy of it, which also means forever, right? In 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, any new node that uses Ethereum will also store that, right? You can argue that it's not fair because, hey, even people participating in EOS, ICO no longer care about that record because they already have their tokens on the real EOS blockchain. But again, why should everybody store that forever? Right? So that's because there's no incentive to clear it. That's the problem, right? You pay once and store forever, and it's there forever. Okay. Now, what happens when you have that? Which means, well, storage is also cost, right? So that means higher operating cost for phone nodes. And again, this, if you don't regulate this, this only grows one direction, right? Which means it will become more and more, and then in the future, the operating cost of phone nodes just only go one direction. Okay, so Ethereum community has this EIP 103 storage rent to talk about this problem. I'm not going to dive into this. If you're familiar with this concept, right, this is what Ethereum community tried to do. They're saying, okay, for a smart contract, you have to pay rent, right? So let's say, just make it simple, every month you have to pay some amount of ETH to have this contract still be valid, state still be accessible. If you don't pay that rent, then this contract goes to hibernate, and basically means you cannot interact with it anymore unless you pay up, right, to the current ETH. But again, that has a lot of problems, UX problems. There's a problem who pays for that rent, right? For EOS smart contract, ICO smart contract, again, there's tens of thousands users participated. Who should pay for the rent, right? There are many problems. I'm not going to talk about that. Let's go to the next point. Okay, so now starving layer 1 problem. Again, if you scale on layer 2, like what Jen had just talked about, right? So scaling on layer 2, and we are a believer in layer 2 technologies, right? We think that there's a lot of research being done, a lot of engineering being done on layer 2, and it's just a matter of time, maybe next year, maybe a couple of years, then layer 2 tech will be more and more available and mature. Then, the advantage of layer 2 is it's really cheap and really fast, right? So, which means more and more transactions are going to move to layer 2. But when that happens, there are going to be less layer 1 transactions, right? Which leads to, well, if layer 1 transaction token designed to facilitate transactions, that means there's less demand on the tokens, right? What happens when you have less demand on tokens? Then the token price will be lower, which means lower layer 1 security, right? And then, and this is not what we want, right? Remember the first slide, the ideal token economics, you have to make the blockchain long-term sustainably secure. Okay, again, we're just talking about problems. I'm sorry, I'm not revealing our own design yet, but just sort of setting up the stage. So now we're going to this new problem, right? We call the interest alignment or misalignment. Now, Bitcoin ecosystem participants, we believe the interests are not aligned, right? So you can see, I mean, this is already not a secret, right? There's a huge fight against this already. You have store value users, which want to make sure that the blockchain block is limited and maybe smaller blocks, so that long term it will help the system to remain secure and decentralized. And you have big blockers that want fast transactions and more throughput transactions, so that the transaction fee is going to be lower and good for mini exchange scenarios, right? So you see a lot of businesses and people want to retreat Bitcoin as a payment first peer-to-peer cash system on this camp. So not aligned, right? Fighting. You have Ethereum system ecosystem participants. We believe the interests are not aligned, right? So just quickly go through. Developers want adoption, which means they want more users to use their smart contracts, their system. They want transaction fees to be low, right? They don't want to pay a lot for transactions. ETH holders, right? Again, they're holding ETH, so they really just want their ETH to appreciate, becoming, richer, right? And then you have miners, which really just want their income to be, higher amount of income, right? And you have asset token holders. They actually don't care about ETH price, right? They want their own tokens to appreciate. Now, just quickly going through these incentives, you can see that developers want cheaper transactions, but again, ETH the intrinsic value of ETH is to pay for transactions, right? So when you have cheaper transactions, people don't have to, hold a lot of ETH to pay for these transactions, right? So that may not lead to appreciation of ETH values and so on. I'm not going to dive into each one of them individually, but you can already see this misalignment of tokens. And the fact that, in Ethereum community, now again, I'm not saying this is bad, I'm just pointing out the fact that you hear a lot of people say build, right? Let's build stuff, right? It's very developer focused, but you rarely see people say, hey, let's HODL ETH, right? Or at least from the leadership, say HODL ETH. What's the reason, right? Why do they not encourage people to become ETH holders to increase the value of the Ethereum token, right? It's because even you increase the Ethereum value, it doesn't help with developer with the lower cost, right? So Ethereum's intrinsic value as a decentralized computation machine, right? Its intrinsic value is, you can say the cost you pay for decentralized computation is determined by the demand of transactions on the blockchain, right? If it's more crowded, more congested, then there's more, the gas price will be higher, therefore people have to acquire more ETH to pay for this gas, right? But not about ETH price, okay? Okay, so ETH holders keep getting diluted to secure tokens, right? So this is, again, a typical problem with commons, right? So this is, think about if you're an Ethereum holder, ETH token holder, you are increasingly getting diluted with new token issuance, and this token issuance, either it's POW or POS, go to the miners, right? To be the security budget of ETH platform. So your tokens that you hold are increasingly diluted over time to provide security. A lot of them go to make sure that asset tokens are maintained secure over time, right? But the asset token holders, their tokens are not diluted, right? Only the platform tokens are diluted over time, right? So you wonder if that's fair, or it's, and which leads to the question, like, why do you HODL ETH? If you don't use it to pay for computation, then why do you HODL ETH, right? All right, so value capture, again, another problem. Very few projects have effective value capture mechanism to the native tokens. So I just list these two dimensions: value capture as a multi-asset platform. Again, going back to the previous point, right? If value grows on your platform as asset values, right? As a multi-asset platform, its asset value grows. Can the native tokens capture part of that value or not, right? In Ethereum, with the token economics of Ethereum, we think that's not the case, right? It only captures demand for decentralized transactions, and also value capture in the specific use case, right? So let's say I'm a blockchain to do blockchain. What is a good example? Like payments, right? I'm a payment blockchain. Then, okay, you can capture part of value when you start. We're the only one, but are you fork proof, right? So when Litecoin introduced another way to do transactions, when Dogecoin come around, says, hey, I have even cheaper fees. And then when Bitcoin forks 100 times, right? So are you fork proof that can you really capture the value of the use case, for example, payments? Or or the demand is going to be the same, but the supply is going to be infinite, right? With clones and forks and so on, right? Can you capture the value of your scenario, use case, right? Fork proof. Okay, so been talking all about problems. So hopefully, let's look at our own cryptoeconomic design and see what we do to tackle these problems. Okay, fancy diagram, right? So this is a overview of the Nervos network, right? So Jen talked about the layer 1 protocol, which is the green circle in the middle, right? So that's the common knowledge base. So you can see, by the way, this is even very big, but it's actually just one blockchain, right? All the green area is one blockchain. And this is common knowledge base, which means all the assets are preserved in the layer 1 protocol, right? And around it, you see many sort of blockchains shooting out from it or hanging out. dangling on this layer 1 protocol. So that's our layer 2s, right? So the idea is that the topology of the overall Nervos network is one preservation-focused store of asset chain, plus many, many, many transactional chains, right, or transactional systems around it. Now, we're not the only sort of one in the center and many around topology you can find, right? But we think this is the only way that you can make the topology make sense. In other words, the separation is not about whether you want to relay messages across different chains, right? It's not about having a random beacon so that everybody can use, all the other chains can use, right? So if you do this topology, you have to have, the separation is about values versus transaction. We'll talk about that a little bit about why that's the case. So why, right? So I think this is one of our key contribution to the cryptoeconomic theory, or cryptoeconomic design in blockchain is that preservation, the goal of preservation, or the force of preservation, and the force of transaction, they're fundamentally opposing each other, right? So in other words, you cannot optimize both at the same time, right? So you can only optimize, if you optimize for preservation, right? That means, you know, this blockchain is about preserving value, like Bitcoin or BTC, or preserving assets, right, like Nervos Common Knowledge Base, then they necessarily are not going to be a very good transactional system, right? Because to be a good transactional system, you need limited scope, you need a very fast finality, you need very efficient transactions, that means cheap transactions, lower cost. You need very high throughput, right? So those, if you want to optimize for those, well, you're not going to be very decentralized. You're not going to have global consensus, right? You're not going to be sustainable. And then if you want to, and you know, users for good transactional systems want really good cheap fees. And again, that's opposing if the fee is very cheap, and people who are want a good transaction systems, they don't necessarily care about security or decentralization, right? Think about like one use case is exchanges, where people do exchange, right? So even there is decentralized exchange, but people still go for centralized exchange. That's because that's the cheapest place that can happen. It's also most efficient place, right? The operation, like the because everything is together, so the efficiency of order matching can be very high, right? So people only have for transactional systems, people only have very limited time exposure to decentralization risk, right? So if I'm trading my Bitcoin for Litecoin, for example, on exchange, there's only that moment I do transaction, maybe the security exchange just got hacked or something, that I might lose my coins, right? Assuming I pull it back right away afterwards, right? But I want that efficiency. I want a cheaper cost. Okay, so again, you know, happy to answer your questions when we do Q&As, more about this. Okay, native tokens, we talk about this, right? So native tokens CKB is common knowledge bytes. One token gives the right to occupy 1 byte of state storage, right? So that's the intrinsic value of the token. So native coins of Nervos common knowledge base, again, this is the first, right? It's simultaneously a state and money, right? So money as in, I can pay you with our native currency, right? It's a money the same as I can pay you Bitcoin, I can pay you ETH, right? I can pay you our native currency as money to transfer value. But it's also simultaneously a state, right? In other words, you have to own Nervos native tokens to hold stuff on it, right? So this, you can be holding a smart contract, you can be holding you know, assets and whatnot, right? So it's simultaneously state and money. All right, let's go to the next. Okay, so issuance, right? So monetary policy bounds the expansion of state storage capacity, right? Again, Jen talked about this. Because the native currency is state bytes, right? So then the rate you're increasing native currency, you're issuing native currency, means that's the maximum seeding rate you can expand the state storage, right? So it bounds the growth of state capacity, helping to bound the cost of phone operations. Again, Ethereum does not have any bound at all, so I could theoretically create transactions tomorrow. I can spend some, gas to just jam a lot of stuff into Ethereum and raise everybody's operating cost, right? But we do have this bound. It has Bitcoin-like base issuance schedule, right? So which means, again, we're talking about issuance, right? So we're going to reward miners to bootstrap the network, right? So issued with the block rewards. And then it halves every 4 years, just like Bitcoin does. It's hard capped, drop to zero, right? So this part of the issuance, just like a Bitcoin issuance schedule, right? Drop to zero eventually. Okay. Now, remember in the beginning, I said, hey, this has a problem. Any hard cap system has a problem, right? It's, at least credible research has pointed out, and nobody has refuted, that the network needs to continuously raise revenue from occupation of global state, right? So we need to have a way to reward the miners continuously, even after the hard cap has reached. So this is the state rent problem discussed in the ETH community, and I think we found a way to say that even that issuance stops, right? That going down to zero, that issuance stops. We still have to find a way to compensate the miners, not just by transaction fees, because that's not going to be sustainable. So what we're going to do is we're going to use state rent, right? The state rent problem, that the more you occupy, the more value you have to pay to the miners. So we're going to use that as a continuous revenue stream for the miners, state rent collected. But again, we're not going to collect the state rent the same. In Nervos, we do this don't via continuous payments or periodic payments, but we do that with targeted inflation of native holders used to store state, right? So we call this targeted inflation. So think about this, right? So our native token circulation is the maximum, state that you can occupy. Now, some of the tokens are going to be used to store data or state, and some of them may not be used to store data, right? So if you want to charge, if you want to collect rent or tax from the users of state, one way you can think about this is, right, tax, inflation, right? People from economics, you want to collect money from people, tax or inflation. Inflation is infinitely easier to collect, right? This is March already. So what you do is if you can target inflate the people that are using their capacity to store data, that'll be fantastic. But it's very difficult to do. So how do you do that? Well, so we're going to add another type of issuance we call secondary issuance, right? So when we introduce an additional layer of inflation, that inflates everybody. Everybody gets inflated, right? Which means that, yes, we are able to collect some value. Again, we give this inflation to miners. So we collect some value from the people that are using their capacity to store data, but they've also collected unnecessary tax from people that are not using their data to store data, right? So what we do is we have a contract called Nervos DAO, and this is we return the unnecessary state tax, if you will, back to the long-term token holders. So the idea is, if you're not using you're not using your tokens to store data, just deposit into this special smart contract on Nervos DAO, right? And then the consensus mechanism will drop the extra tax collected or necessary tax collected from these folks back to this Nervos DAO and distribute it to everybody, right? So you get back of what, the unnecessary inflation. So only people that are using their data, because if you use your data to store, you sell to store data, you cannot deposit into this Nervos DAO, right? So that's the whole idea. All right. Okay. So miner compensation, right? Total revenue of miners is base issuance plus state rent income via the secondary issuance, right? So again, people that are storing their data, they're not going to be getting secondary issuance. That goes to the miners, plus fees, transaction fees, right? So that's miner compensation. And okay, so that's the details of our economic design. So now let's talk about, we list all these problems in the beginning, and let's look at why would we believe this could solve these problems. please. Okay, so again, first of all, the base issuance, Bitcoin-like issuance will stop, right? But the second issuance is going to be continuous, right? So one example I found very useful for people to understand this first issuance, second issuance is, it's as if you have Bitcoin. So Bitcoin in the beginning, you have 50 Bitcoins per block as reward. And then it goes down to 25, 12.5, right? And so on over time, every 4 years, drops half. So for us, it's as if in the beginning you have 51 Bitcoins. Again, 50 Bitcoins plus 1 Bitcoin of secondary issuance, right? After 4 years, you got 25 plus 1, which is 26, right? After that, it's 13.5. So there's 1 Bitcoin of secondary issuance over time. On top of this, keep dropping down to 0 issuance. So even that stops, you still have this constant issuance, we call secondary issuance, right? And this gives what happens after hard cap problem, because you have constant issuance. So miners will be compensated in a familiar way, and then this we know in Nakamoto consensus, right? So this is what directs miner to do the right thing based on the protocol. Okay. Now, obviously the problem is this. Okay, you have perpetual inflation. People don't like that, right? And the problem is like, okay, you don't have hard cap, then I'm just keep getting diluted, right? Now, we need to protect the economic interest of long-term token holders. So how do you do that? As long as they lock their tokens in the special smart contract Nervos DAO, right? Again, the secondary issuance is only to collect state rents, right? It's only to target inflate those who use it. If you lock your tokens, it's as if the permanent secondary issuance does not exist, right? I'm happy again to dive into this mathematically. Okay, now, so this is how we protect long-term token holders. Now, the heavy asset problem. This is the same slide I brought from begin, right? So how do we solve the heavy assets problem when you have more demand on the assets, right? So more assets in custody, more assets are running the platform. That leads to more capacity used, right? More capacity used, which means higher miner income. Again, more capacity used, which means less people are going to be able to store their tokens into the Nervos DAO, which means, right, the miners will get a bigger share of the secondary issuance over time, right? Which means higher security, and then now higher security also leads to more asset in custody. Again, common knowledge base is not a transactional system, right? It means that people don't come to common knowledge base to be able to perform transactions very efficiently. They come here because this is the secure place to store their assets. So as security goes up, so is the intrinsic value of the system. Therefore, more assets will come. All right, aligned interests, right? So again, just brief review of what everybody wants. Miners want more income. Users want security. This is different from a computation platform. A computation platform, a transactional platform, people always want cheaper cost. But us as a preservational platform, people actually want more security. That's why you preserve stuff. You want it to be secure, just park there, right, over time. And users more security. How do you get more security? Well, higher miner income means better security, right? You have higher security budget. That means you get more security. And hodlers or holders, right, they want higher token price. And you see that higher token price actually supports everybody's objective in this framework, right? Everybody's happy. Now, okay, transitive commons. Now, here we're talking about two types of transitive commons. One is security commons, right? This is where you have asset tokens riding on top of the security that the platform tokens owners provide, right? So in our system, asset tokens don't just write the platform security provided by platform hodlers for free, because again, these guys, could be diluted, right, in Ethereum, but they contribute to the security by generating demand to occupy state storage, right? So the more asset projects we have, the more users demand on these asset projects, they're going to occupy more storage, which put demand on the native platform tokens, right? And we call this property store of assets, right? So the fact that there's a better a slide on the next page. I'll leave that a little bit. Transitive storage commons, right? So users that use storage pay proportionally to their site storage used and duration of usage, right? So again, remember the Ethereum, the EOS ICO problem on the Ethereum platform, right? So now you actually have incentive to free that up. Because what? If you free that up, you recycle back the native platform tokens, which you can sell and get your money back, right? Yep. Okay. Okay, so the next one is value capture, right? So we believe that value capture, again, is very essential to multi-asset platform. When we say value capture, it really just means the value riding on top of the platform need to be captured somewhat to the native tokens, right? So the security and the storage of native platform is a common good for the entire ecosystem, right? Somebody has to pay tax or expense to these common goods. Otherwise, it's going to be, breaking over time. So, so we directly turn the demand of asset token to the platform tokens, which serves as what I think is the best value capture mechanism anywhere you see in the blockchain space today. Fork resistance, right? So how do you manufacture fork resistance, right? It's actually a very, very difficult problem. The best way we know is just to look at people that have done it or projects that have done it, right? So, for example, Bitcoin has been forked hundreds of times, but it still is, by asset value, is the dominant asset in the payment network, right? So that comes from it being the first mover in its scenario, its use case, and also it has the best network effect, and also it has the best security, right? Again, these are the things that we try to design our platform against. We're also a preservational platform, not a transactional platform, right? We believe transactional platform is very easy to be fork resistance, right? Another person can just fork your blockchain or clone your blockchain, your code, and launch their own blockchain, and it has as good transactional property as yours, right? Because it's probably empty, nobody uses. Therefore, it's very cheap to transact on, right? We believe transactional system is very difficult to capture use case value, right? So security level, network effect of being the first mover in that use case can do that, which is what we'll try to emulate.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why do you care about forks? Are you worried about them competing with you? Somebody forks
Well, I mean, it's not I worry about them, it will happen, right?
Sure, but
yeah.
So if somebody forks it and does their own thing, why do you care?
We don't care,
oh, good.
right?
Okay.
So, I mean, this is the reason that.
Sorry, why are you trying to make it fork resistant if you don't care about forks?
Well, that's the reason for a token holder to hold our tokens. If they know their chain.
Your tokens will go down in value because somebody's competing with you with a fork of your chain.
Our token value, it will be, for transactional systems, right, the token value will go down because.
But actually in forks it often doesn't. Often in forks both tokens retain value.
Right, that's because of the transactional system, right? Again, token value is determined by intrinsic value of the system. Now, if you can fork a system that's as good, it provide as good transactional value as the original one, then people are like, I'm equivalent. I mean, this one's good too.
So you're worried about the competition, somebody forking your site and competing with you.
I'm not worried about it. This is the reason for people to,
right. This is the reason to build in fork resistance.
Right, so that people
compete with you by forking your chain.
Right, so people will more willing to hold tokens, which contribute to security of the system, which is what we care about.
Okay.
That you got to be long-term sustainable and secure, right? If you can be breaking down by being forked 100 times, then that's not.
I'm sorry, you keep going back. You keep saying, talk about forks and breaking down is two. I mean, those are two separate things, right?
Right, I mean, economically broken down, not like technically breaking down, not like attacked. But,
Sure.
but if your security goes down, then it's easier to get attacked, right?
Okay.
Right, so which is we do care about as a provisional system. Okay. So finally, we talk about developer costs and first-class assets, and we'll talk about this because people have asked the question quite about of this and say, hey, if you have to charge, if you ask developers to pay for the storage cost, and for some contract maybe have a lot of entries as part of their state, then if your token goes up many times, then their costs will also go up many times, right? And so we have a concept called first-class asset. I think Jen talked a little bit about that in the previous presentation. But the idea is here, if you think about smart contract in Ethereum, right? So in Nervos CKB base, it's not constructed the same way. So here you have, we call asset definition cell. You have a cell capacity lock, Again, same as ETXOs. And then this asset definition is a snippet of code. This is this code part in Ethereum smart contract, right? And you have these assets parts, right? So let's say this is CryptoKitties, right? So the code for CryptoKitties goes here. This is what developers have to pay to have their code to be on common knowledge base. Now, if I'm a kitty holder, right, I actually own a kitty by my own lock. This is not going to be aggregated with other 10,000 people's cats, right? This is my cat, and I can unlock it, right? Which means I pay for the storage cost of my kitty, right? Which is, it's probably just like a mapping between, address and keys, IDs of the cat. So it wouldn't be quite a bit. It wouldn't be a lot, right? So some other person pays for her cat as well, right? So again, in terms of the tragedy of commons, probably economics is a very well studied field. My wife is actually a PhD, sort of studying this in this area, right? But one of the very, very early frameworks to solve this problem is called property right, right? So instead of you put everybody and say, hey, this is everybody's property and you all together take care of it, maybe nobody will do anything, but you can divide and give people property right and say, hey, this is your part of this. Therefore, you have to pay for the maintenance for it, and you have to take care of it and over time and so on. So this is very similar. If you have account model where you have all the people's state aggregated together in this account smart contract, then who pays for the storage fees, right? Again, how do you even collect tax from it? It's very inefficient to collect tax simultaneously from 10,000 people. Everybody contribute a little bit, right? That's very, very inefficient and difficult to do. But with that, again, go back to, with this, it's very easy because I just need to use my capacity to hold my cats. And I don't have to do anything. I don't pay for anything, right? Dilute me every year a little bit, right? That's all, right? So that's the income that even there's no transaction in the system, miners can have the state rent, coming from inflation to pay them for ongoing sustainability. Okay, last one is a summary of cryptoeconomics. So, we want to be store of assets, which is a generalized form of store of value. In Bitcoin, it's a store of value system because there's only one asset. It's Bitcoin itself, right? But we have a multi-asset platform. You have to store the asset, not just your own tokens, but also all the asset tokens on top of it. Again, which require you to capture some of the value to turn to supply of security, right? Sometimes we call this like the rich country also needs strong military problem, right? So your security is basically the military that protect the country. Otherwise, if the country becomes richer and richer, people become richer, but your military stays the same, guess what? You're going to lose in wars. People are going to invade you. That's what happened to Greece, I think, and the Romans, right? So store of value and store of assets, right? Align incentives, right? So in this system, because we push all the transactions to layer 2s, then our users actually value security and don't value transactions. Okay, sustainability, we'll talk about sustainable, secure, sustainably centralized, right? And in the end, the value capture. Again, value have to be there for all this to work, right? So that the native platform token holders will be better off and people willing to hold the tokens to capture the value. And that's the summary. I think that's it. And we're going to release the paper tomorrow. So if you're going to be in our Telegram, we're going to drop that there. And I think the rest is questions. Yes. Okay. I think he's first.
On the secondary issuance, sounds like it's a fixed supply.
Yeah.
Versus say a fixed inflation rate. Is there any particular reason why you chose to go that route versus a fixed inflation rate where the amount would increase over time as the supply increases?
Why the secondary issuance is, there is a reason for that. I think, if you look at, so fixed supply basically, fixed supply gives you, so it's about like how the value is accrued over time, right? So if you have, let's say every year you inflate 2% instead of a same number, right? If you inflate 2%, then that means you're going to be creating over time a lot more tokens if you were to constant inflation, right? So which means every single token's value is going to be more diluted, even though the entire market cap could be the same, but the value accrual is more to number of tokens, right, than through increase of every token's value. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I guess the increased security, which is the reason you're doing the secondaries in the first place, wouldn't make up for the additional labor.
Right. Because again, miners get income from part of it, right? So we want miners' portion of that to be, every token price goes up, and then they get the same number of tokens. Then that's how, in the early days, I mean, we still have that, fixed layer 1 protocol, not layer 1, type 1 or base issuance, right? So that number of, so every year it's predictable how many number of tokens miners will get, right? So if we accrue value to more price per token instead of number of tokens, then that security value would go up as well.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
So you mentioned how cells can be derived from a single asset definition, and then the
Yeah.
asset definition might be like a code snippet or something.
Yeah.
Would it be accurate to say that so each of these cells has a lock script that the user defines?
Yes.
Every time the lock script executes, does it reference the asset definition code snippet in order to modify the state of each cell when you consume it?
Yeah, close. It's not about so there are two scripts, right? So can we go back to that page? No. Yeah. So there's one log script and then type script. Log script is it checks your authority on this cell, which means this checks whether you can put this on transaction inputs, right? And this script, which is asset definition script, checks whether you can put this on output, right? So, you have to be the owner to be able to unlock this at all, to be able to put on inputs. Now, from input to output, you have to be able to, think about this CryptoKitty state transition rules. You have to be able to make sure it validates true against that rule, so you can put it on outputs. So there are two types of scripts.
And then I'm assuming that you provide the output cell if you do have the permission to be able to use this cell, and then the output cell asset state just needs to check out with the TypeScript execution.
Correct.
To check that it's a valid state.
Correct. Yeah. Yes.
You were talking about how the value accrues from the second layer assets down to the base layer assets.
Correct.
Right. So my understanding is that that's purely from infrastructure and resources standpoint, in the sense that every byte that's stored on the chain is the same cost.
Correct.
Versus, but the second layer asset is going to have different costs, right? So there's going to be, this fat head and long tail distribution of value versus one byte in the long tail asset is going to be, much less in value versus one byte of data in the fat head asset.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So is there some kind of correlation in value to address that type of uneven distribution of value when it translates to the data that's being consumed?
Okay. So is there any correlation between? Can you repeat the last question?
Yeah, imagine I add I am in the long tail.
Right.
I'm one of the assets in the long tail,
Mm-hmm.
and I am adding 100 bytes.
Right.
To the chain. It's gonna cost the chain the same amount for me to add it versus you. Say if your asset is worth 1,000 times more than me. Right?
Correct.
We have the same amount of bytes, but it's gonna have the same cost to the underlying chain. But it's gonna your asset's gonna be 1,000 times more valuable than my asset.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there some kind of is that going to affect how the value flows from the top from the asset to the baseline asset?
So think about this, right? One good analogy, we make a parallel to the real world economy, if you will, is land, right? So we're in New York, right? So you can see even in Manhattan, some parts of land is used to build a taco shop or, fast food restaurant. And some parcel of land, maybe just next to it, it's an office building. Obviously, the value they derive from this land cannot be the same, right? It's probably a lot of economic, a lot of value in this building than in this taco shop, right? But what we want to do is, if there is more demand, to build stuff here on this land, let's say, this building just, this land is becoming really, really expensive. People really want to come here. So there's more demand to build buildings, right? Equivalent to like tokens here. If there's more demand to put buildings in this land, then they will put pressure on the land price to go up. Now, the taco shop owner can still operate there if they want, right? Or they can sell their tokens. But the idea is, more people want to put their building in this land, the land price will increase. Even the taco shop owner, that's their choice, right? So if they feel like that's better for them to sell, and again, which is also good, it clears the state storage space for the decentralization of the system. So over time, we see that as the common knowledge base grows and adoption and that, the land, the space occupation is going to be taken by more and more valuable or value-intensive assets, or we call common knowledge. It may not be just assets, right? Because in the future, data is assets, right? Digital natives. That the space, the value density of these bytes will go up, right? Which again kicks off a network effect, because when the value density goes up, your native token becomes more expensive, more secure, and then once you are more secure, you attract more of the big buildings to come here, because you have better fences or better army to protect these buildings, right? So that's what we say is may not be network effect, but positive feedback loop over time. So this is one of the reasons. On the first slide, you remember I put 5 things there as ideal cryptoeconomics. One of them is, how do you provide growth engine? How do you serve as a growth engine of the project over time? And then the last one, how do you capture it, right? You create value, you attract value, and then you capture value. That's why people hold your tokens, right? Yeah, please.
So let's say I have a transaction that consumes 2 cells.
Yeah.
Is one of the cells able to reference the end state of the other cell that gets consumed in that transaction in order to like try to compose together 2 different assets?
On the same transaction?
Yeah, like if there were like 2 input cells, and
Yeah.
I had one cell that was a part of one asset definition, and I had one cell that's a part of another asset definition, and I want to do something like conditional based upon the first cell. The first cell represents asset 1. Is cell 2 able to like reference the state of cell 1 and basically say that my lock script evaluates the true if
TypeScript, not lock script. Yeah, not lock script, but TypeScript.
TypeScript,
Yeah. I think what you're asking, put a real example would be, can I put a CryptoKitty and some other, asset together to form, right? Because they were going to be separate types.
yeah, just basically, can I do like things conditional on?
Yeah, you can. You can. Again, it's Turing complete language, so you can compose these types and make sure. This is typical, like in, there's a concept of smart contract platform called composability, right? Means you can build your smart contract on other people's primitives or smart contracts, right? So your, on your inputs, you may have input cells belong to different contracts, so to speak, right? And they have their own asset definitions. You have Starbucks points, and then you have, Cisco stocks, and somehow you say, I want to find, synergy between these holders. So if you're a Cisco employee, want to buy Starbucks coffee, I'm just making this up, in Cisco Cafe, then you get like some discounts, right? So that's possible. Yeah. And probably a better example would be like the building blocks of like DeFi, decentralized finance. You have like a loan, and then you want to do, you have like a native coin, native stable coins, and have some loans, and you want to build like fancy financial application on top of it. Yeah, you can definitely do that.
Yeah, I guess what I was curious about was like at a cell level.
Yeah.
That sort of ballpark description of what happens at a cell level, where you have the TypeScript of one cell of one asset make a reference to
Well, in that case, right? So here, you have, let's say this is type 1, this is type 2, right? That's an example. And we put both in inputs, right? And then on the outputs, maybe you can have like one output from these two inputs. And then that output can refer to a type 3, right? And this type 3, actually you need to pull code from both type 1 and type 2 to make sure, it's composing of these logics, composition of these logics. So that could work. Yeah. And you can define it that way in type 3 asset definitions. Yeah. Questions? Okay, I think we're good. All right, thanks everybody. We're gonna be hanging around for a bit, so if you want to, come here and talk to us, please do. Yeah, there's also drinks and more cookies.